January 20th, 1953, President-elect Dwight David Eisenhower sat in a limousine outside the White House, refusing to enter the building where Harry S. Truman waited. The temperature was 49 degrees. This was not a minor scheduling issue or a simple misunderstanding. It was a calculated insult delivered at what should have been American democracy's most dignified moment, the peaceful transfer of power. Eisenhower, the 62-year-old Supreme Allied Commander of World War II, the victor of Europe, and the most popular military figure since Ulysses S. Grant, had just been elected president in a landslide. Yet, on this day, he would not walk 20 feet to shake the hand of the man who had offered him almost everything. The man inside the White House, 68-year-old Harry S. Truman, was a former farmer and haberdasher who had steered the nation through the early, desperate years of the Cold War. He had made the decision to use atomic weapons, confronted Stalin, and initiated the Marshall Plan. Crucially, just 7 years earlier, Truman had offered to make Eisenhower President of the United States on the Democratic ticket, with Truman himself stepping down to be vice president. Eisenhower, claiming he was a soldier, not a politician, had refused. In 1952, he changed his mind, running as a Republican against Truman's party and legacy. Now, he forced the outgoing president to come to him like a servant summoned to the curb. CBS correspondent Eric Sevareid captured the feeling in 3 words. It was a shocking moment. The relationship had not always been broken. Once, Truman had called Eisenhower the greatest military mind of the age. The break happened slowly, over months and years, through a series of choices and betrayals. The first crack appeared in July 1945 in Germany, where the newly in office President Truman met General Eisenhower. Truman, feeling unprepared after Roosevelt's death, admired military leadership and saw in Eisenhower the future of American leadership. He told Eisenhower, "General, there is nothing you may want that I won't try to help you get, including the presidency in 1948. Eisenhower declined, insisting he was a soldier, not a politician. In 1946-1947, their professional relationship remained respectful and productive. Truman appointed Eisenhower as Army Chief of Staff and then as the first Supreme Commander of NATO. Then, in 1947, Truman made the extraordinary offer again, this time in his private diary. Fearing a presidential run by the autocratic Douglas MacArthur, Truman proposed that Eisenhower run as a Democrat. Truman wrote he would gladly step aside and run as Eisenhower's vice president, adding that he would be happy outside this great white jail known as the White House. This revealed how much Truman valued Eisenhower and how little confidence he had in his own political future at that moment. But Eisenhower declined for the 3rd time, still stating he was not interested in politics even when the offer was delivered again by the Secretary of the Army. Against all predictions, Truman won the 1948 election on his own terms. But Eisenhower's repeated refusals, which always left the door slightly open, had planted a question in Truman's mind. The answer came in 1952, when Eisenhower announced he would seek the Republican nomination. Truman felt personally betrayed. Eisenhower had twice refused the presidency from Truman and the Democrats, claiming he didn't want the office, only to now seek it as a Republican. However, political differences were not what broke the relationship beyond repair. The breaking point was what happened during the campaign concerning George Catlett Marshall. Marshall was Eisenhower's mentor, patron, and friend. As Army Chief of Staff during World War II, Marshall had made Eisenhower's career possible, promoting him rapidly and recommending him to lead the D-Day invasion, a command Marshall had wanted for himself. After the war, Marshall served as Truman's Secretary of State, articulating the European Recovery Program, known as the Marshall Plan, for which he later won the Nobel Peace Prize. Marshall also served as Secretary of Defense during the Korean War. Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin began attacking Marshall in 1950 and 1951, riding high on anti-communist hysteria. McCarthy's accusations were insane and grotesque, but politically effective. He called Marshall's career a conspiracy so immense and an infamy so black as to dwarf any previous venture, and accused him of actively working to advance communist goals. Senator William Jenner of Indiana went further, calling Marshall a living lie and a frontman for traitors. Truman was enraged, calling Marshall the greatest living American, and fully expected Eisenhower to defend his mentor. In October 1952, Eisenhower was scheduled to give a speech in McCarthy's home state of Wisconsin. McCarthy would be on stage with him. Eisenhower's staff prepared a text that included a clear defense of Marshall, describing him as a man dedicated with singular selflessness and the profoundest patriotism. However, his advisors urged him to remove the paragraph to avoid offending Wisconsin Republicans and creating unnecessary controversy. Eisenhower listened, making the calculation that winning the election was more important than defending Marshall. Standing on stage with McCarthy, Eisenhower praised his anti-communist efforts, endorsed his crusade, and said nothing about George Marshall, not one word. Reporters who had seen the advance text knew this was a deliberate choice. Eisenhower had weighed defending his mentor against winning Wisconsin, and Wisconsin had won. The news coverage was brutal. Truman's reaction was immediate. He called it one of the most shocking things in the history of this country and called Eisenhower just a coward who ought to be ashamed for what he did. Truman made defending Marshall a central theme of his remaining campaign, questioning how Eisenhower could be trusted to stand up to the Soviets if he couldn't stand up to Joe McCarthy.
Eisenhower became angry, convinced that Truman was using Marshall as a political weapon. But for Truman, loyalty and character mattered, and Eisenhower had failed the test publicly. 2 weeks earlier, Eisenhower had also campaigned in Indianapolis with Senator William Jenner, the man who had called Marshall a frontman for traitors. Despite knowing what Jenner had said, Eisenhower appeared with him and smiled for the cameras, telling aides he felt dirty, but that it was necessary to win. To Truman, this pattern revealed a fundamental flaw. Eisenhower was willing to sacrifice principle for votes and abandon loyalty for electoral advantage. By election day, the personal animosity was impossible to hide. Eisenhower won in a landslide, taking 55% of the popular vote and 442 electoral votes. They met once, on November 18, 1952, for a transition briefing at the White House. The atmosphere was stiff, formal, embarrassing, and unrewarding. Truman tried to brief the president-elect on how the White House actually worked, but Eisenhower listened with visible impatience. Eisenhower felt Truman was wasting his time with obvious information and partisan spin, while Truman thought everything he said went in one ear and out the other. Truman later predicted that Eisenhower would struggle because he would fail to understand the difference between military command, where orders were executed, and presidential leadership, where everything was negotiation and required political skills. Between the election and inauguration, Eisenhower made deliberate breaks from tradition, such as choosing to wear a Homburg hat instead of a silk top hat. The hatred between the two men that day was like a monsoon, according to a White House advisor. Eisenhower resented having to share a car with Truman, and so he made his final decision. He would not enter the White House for the traditional coffee, but would sit in the limousine and make Truman come to him. Inside, Truman saw the car that would not move and knew what was happening. Though he considered refusing, he swallowed his anger and walked outside, fulfilling his responsibility to the country and the office. Truman opened the car door and climbed into the back seat. Eisenhower did not get out. The two men did not speak or look at each other as the car began the drive to the Capitol. At some point, Eisenhower broke the silence to ask who had ordered his son, John, a major serving with combat units in Korea, home for the inauguration. Truman looked at Eisenhower and said, "I did." He explained that he thought it was right and proper for your son to witness the swearing-in of his father to the presidency. Truman had used his authority as commander-in-chief to perform a generous gesture, believing some things, family, historic moments, and the decent thing, mattered more than politics. Eisenhower said nothing in response, offering no "thank you," and simply turned back to looking out the window. He did send a letter several days later thanking Truman. The ride was uncomfortable, cold, and filled with tension. After the ceremony, Truman did not attend the inaugural parade, but left Washington, boarding a train to Independence, Missouri. Eisenhower did not invite him back for state dinners or ceremonies, and for 8 years Truman never set foot in the White House. The two men lived in the state of frozen hostility. The hostility was finally suspended in October 1959 when George Marshall died. At Marshall's funeral, President Eisenhower and former President Truman sat in the same pew, side by side, for the first time since Inauguration Day. Neither man spoke to the other during the service. Over the next 4 years, they saw each other occasionally at other funerals, but always maintained a cold distance. The breakthrough came on November 25, 1963, at the funeral of President John F. Kennedy. Truman and Eisenhower rode in the same car to Arlington National Cemetery, and during the drive, they actually talked. Afterward, Margaret Truman invited the Eisenhowers to lunch, and for an hour the two former presidents sat and talked, reminiscing about old battles, like two old men who had once known each other well. An aide recalled the moment as really heartwarming. They shook hands, a long, lingering, silent handshake, and finally found their way back to something resembling friendship 10 years after that cold morning. The story of January 20, 1953, became part of American political lore. The image of Eisenhower refusing to enter the White House became a symbol of how personal grievances can poison public duty. It was about betrayal. Eisenhower felt betrayed by Truman's campaign attacks, and Truman felt betrayed by Eisenhower's abandonment of George Marshall. Both men let their grievances override their responsibility to the moment. The inauguration is about the continuity of democratic government and the peaceful transfer of power. Eisenhower forgot that when he refused to walk through the door. Truman remembered it when he walked out anyway. The handshake in 1963 suggested that both men eventually understood what they had lost. But on that cold January morning, the insult landed, the damage was done, and two of the most important Americans of the 20th century stayed apart for a decade.